Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for this very timely conversation on Venezuela. This is our third session of this Democracy Action Lab webinar series focused on rebuilding democracy in Venezuela, hosted by the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law here at Stanford University. This series, as you know, examine Venezuela's uncertain transition and the practical challenges that will determine whether if this is a real democratic transition or a democratic opening, and if it can succeed. And each session has focused on critical challenges, and today we turn to which is arguably the most difficult component of any democratic transition, which is the transformation of the security sector reform. Across cases, we know that the evidence is clear. Democratic transitions happen and can succeed if coercive institutions are transformed so that they can operate under civilian control, respect of law, and ensuring security to citizens. Venezuela, however, presents additional complications because in addition to reforming state institutions, like the military, the police, the intelligence services, Venezuela also has to grapple with this complex landscape of armed actors that are operating in the territory that have different revenue streams, different incentives, and different political objectives or objectives in general. And I think understanding the complexity of these dynamics is going to be critical for identifying realistic ways or realistic pathways to reform that could make a democratic transition likely, probable. We're still not in that threshold yet, but and also is going to be critical for democratic consolidation. To help us unpack this very complex landscape, we're very fortunate to have some of the most exceptional experts on security challenges in Venezuela. I'm going to briefly introduce them. They have incredible CVs, as you can imagine, but I'm just going to select a few things from their background so that you know who's in the room, and then we can start. I'm going to introduce first Rebecca Hansom, who is an assistant professor at the Latin American Studies and in the Department of Sociology, Criminology, and Law at the University of Florida. Rebecca is the co-editor of an important volume that I highly recommend. It's The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, Revolution, Crime, and Policing During Chavismo. We are also fortunate to have with us Maria Ignacia Curiel, who is a research scholar here at Stanford's Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, and who is also the research manager at the Democracy Action Lab. She's going to focus on, her research focuses on political solutions to violent conflict and the political incorporation of actors that have violent origins, including guerrillas and other armed groups, and how they interact with political institutions and electoral competition. We are also fortunate to have John Polga, an associate professor of political science at the U.S. Naval Academy. John's research examines how political institutions affect democratic stability, policymaking, and governance, particularly in Latin America. And he's the co-editor of a book I also highly recommend called Authoritarian Consolidation in Times of Crisis, Venezuela under Nicolás Maduro. Thank you, John, for joining us. And we are also privileged to have Harold Trincunas, who is the Deputy Director and Senior Research Scholar at the Center for International Security and Cooperation here at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Harold is one of the leading scholars working on security, governance, and civilian-military relations in Latin America. Again, very long CV. I want to highlight one of his works that is one of my favorites, is Crafting Civilian Control of the Military in Venezuela. It's a 2005 book, great reading, still very relevant, and our panelists are going to have around 10 minutes, each of them, and then we're going to have a Q&A that I hope will help dissipate some of the questions that our audience may have. Again, thank you everybody for joining, and without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor to John, who is going to start us off. Thank you, John.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Hector and the Democracy Action Lab for the invitation to participate today in this event with such a talented group of scholars as you laid out. Before I begin, I have to state that everything I say today is my own personal opinion and not does not represent the opinion, perspective, or position of the U.S. Naval Academy, the Department of the Navy, the Department of Defense, Department of War, or the U.S. Government. So I'm speaking in a private capacity. I think that discussing security reform in Venezuela, this I love the title, this Gordian knot, right? Is so difficult because the military itself, we're going to talk about lots of actors today, but the Fuerza Armada Nacional Bolivariana, the FANB, cannot simply return to the barracks the way that other militaries and parts of Latin America during the third wave or other parts of the world have done because the barracks themselves have been transformed into political and economic headquarters over the past, 25 or so years. Well, actually going on 27 years now. The FANBE functions simultaneously in Venezuela as a governing actor because officers hold ministerial posts and governorships, a veto player capable of blocking democratic consolidation, and an economic actor embedded in state industries and illicit markets, things I'm sure that we're going to talk about today. Officers participate in sectors including mining, food distribution, ports, banking, smuggling networks, and produces, I think, the classic transition dilemma, which is that the actors who can block democratization also control coercion and benefit materially from the status quo. And so, tackling this issue is one that isn't three easy steps. It's not something that you know it can be done in 2 months or 3 months or 6 months or a year, but rather a gradual process that will have to take place over a series of years and involve many different actors in and outside of Venezuela, including probably the United States. So I'm going to begin, with just a basic overview of what the Fanbe is, because I'm sure many people attending today or listening today have some background. But for those who don't, we're talking about not just an army, a navy, and an air force, right? The Ejército, the Armada, and the Aviación Militar Bolivariana, but also the National Guard, the Guardia Nacional Bolivariana, as well as a fifth branch that is kind of unique to Venezuela, which is the Bolivarian militia, right? The Milicia Bolivariana, which is this sprawling and politicized civilian military body that's under the direct command of the president and designed with an explicitly political purpose. And so this fifth body, like the first four bodies, provide enough problems, but that fifth body becomes kind of an especially sticky institution because it is so explicitly political. Beyond that, we also have the General Directorate of Military Counterintelligence, right? The Dirección General de Contrainteligencia Militar, which, at least on paper, is tasked with protecting the FANBE from internal threats, but in practice has functioned as a repressive instrument of the Chavista state. And so just dealing with these actors is different than maybe what reform looked like in Panama post U.S. invasion, right? Or in Grenada, or in countries in Europe after World War II. The situation is quite challenging, right? And so I'm going to begin with political disengagements. And I think a foundational challenge of any civil military reform process is to reduce the military's political prerogatives, right? And Venezuela presents an acute version of this challenge because the FANBE has accumulated substantial formal and informal political prerogatives since 1999, right? Direct representation in cabinet, control over key ministries, a constitutional mandate that explicitly ties the armed forces to this political project, right? And these are not incidental prerogatives, but rather structural. They're embedded in legal frameworks. They're sustained by a political culture in which military loyalty is rewarded, right? And so, where to begin? And I think that there's a broad literature in transitions and in civil relations that looks at lots and lots of mechanisms. Four that I'd like to highlight is, first of all, Constitutional and legal reform is absolutely necessary to revise and replace legal instruments that grant the military these political prerogatives, right? Reforms need to explicitly prohibit active duty officers from holding civilian political office and remove provisions that the armed forces, how they exist in partisan political life. And I think that post-Franco Spain maybe is a good model for this, particular provision. Secondly, negotiated pacts are a necessary instrument, right? They offer credible guarantees to military elites, including amnesty provisions, protection of, pension and retirement entitlements, etc., in exchange for withdrawal from political roles. And O'Donnell and Schmitter talk a lot about this in their analysis of Southern Europe, but especially Latin America during kind of the 1980s. Third, I think restructuring command hierarchies to route military authority through civilian defense ministries rather than directly through the executive helps create some institutional buffers, right? And then fourth, professional military education reform, helping to replace this Bolivarian revolutionary ideology embedded in officer training and curricula, right? To socialize a new generation of officers and norms of democratic subordination and political neutrality, right? And lots of people talk about this. So that's political reforms. I'm going to speak about more, but I'd like to move on to economics for a quick second because reducing the military's political prerogatives is more difficult if the armed forces is allowed to retain economic power, right? Military entrepreneurship can be harmful to the achievement or maintenance of military professionalism and allows the armed forces to recapture political influence. So disengagement is a competing and I think probably kind of simultaneous challenge for reformers. We know that since at least 2013, the Venezuelan government has established more than a dozen military firms in 20 economic sectors, including agricultural, mining, oil, construction, and banking. Officers occupy senior positions in these and other state-run enterprises, which allows them to legally or in many cases illicitly control core areas of state and government, state and the government to enrich themselves. So, these vested economic interests can be really resistant to reform since the officers have material stakes in their continued autonomy. And I think this is part of like the coup-proofing strategy of Nicolás Maduro was tying these officers to the benefits they enjoyed politically and economically, and that the risk of getting overthrowing Nicolás Maduro would put into doubt that status quo. Here again, the academic literature suggests several possible mechanisms to promote economic disengagement. Transparent budgeting, right? To bring off-budget military enterprises under legislative oversight. So like none of this can be done independently of reforms that need to take place in other sectors and institution building that needs to take place in other sectors of the country, right? And so this requires obviously building up the National Assembly again, right? And creating transparent budgeting mechanisms, or rather ensuring that they are followed, right? And with oversight. Secondly, privatization with accountability would help transfer military-owned enterprises to civilian control. Third, countries in Eastern Europe and ex-Soviet bloc countries, they reform their militaries in part because of conditional aid and external leverage, right? IMF conditionality in the European context, NATO and EU memberships. So maybe something like that to accelerate economic disengagement and raise the opportunity cost of military corporate autonomy. And fourth, severing officer retirement pathways into state enterprises helps to eliminate these informal mechanisms through which military influence persists, even after formal withdrawal. Okay. I'm gonna move on. I have 7 more general recommendations, and I think maybe just touching upon them really quickly, one by one, for 60 seconds. Maybe Harold, who's going to speak next, can expand upon some of them, or maybe he does expand upon some of them. And if he doesn't, I'm happy to come back in the Q&A and talk a lot about them. So research on how militaries move from what scholars call subjective control to objective control, which is to say subordination to civilian authorities, identifies several pathways. Institutional redesign is one, right? Creating or strengthening civilian-led defense ministries with genuine authority over budgets, procurement, and promotions. That's one. Two, like I said, for the political prerogatives part, not to be too alliterative, professional military education reform, right? Changing curricula once again. Three, promotion and personnel system reform. We know, and people I have written about, lots of us here have written about um, the personnel system, which is highly politicized, right? So ensuring that advancement is based on professional merit rather than political loyalty or factional affiliation, right? Removing the incentive structure that rewards political involvement. Number four, ensuring legislative oversight capacity, not just legislative oversight, the capacity to do so, right? Building parliamentary defense committees with staff expertise, access to classified information, and genuine budgetary authority. That's four. Five, defense sector transparency and external benchmarks. Again, this idea of transparency and benchmarks, I think, is a through line with all of these reforms. Um, Six, incremental confidence building. David Payan Berlin and others argue that in transitions, objective control is achieved not through grand institutional overhaul, big, rapid, revolutionary change, but the gradual accumulation of civilian decisions, right, and decision-making authority in previously military-dominated domains, right, with each successive assertion of civilian authority normalizing the next. And lastly, building civilian expertise, right? Like a very consistent finding across the scholarly literature, kind of regardless of country, is that the civilian capacity gap is a significant obstacle, is as significant an obstacle as military resistance itself, right? Civilian politicians and bureaucrats typically lack the expertise, right, to exercise meaningful oversight. And so it's going to be necessary to do that. All right. Um, I'm going to speak for 2 more minutes. Do I have 2 more minutes?
Yes, John.
Okay, all right. So, reforming the Bolivarian militia, that is a separate animal, right? Because the militia occupies this ambiguous space, right? It's a state organ, but operationally, I think more resembles a pro-government militia, analogous to a bunch of places in, I don't know, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Egypt, in Iraq, and things like this. And so the reform implication is that you have to deal with this ambiguity institutionally, and you have to either formalize, right, the militia and bring it in completely under the control of the government, including civilian authorities, right, and getting rid of its political nature and character, right? And that's one strand of literature. Carey and Mitchell argue this. And a second line of thinking basically says, well, if reformers believe that the militia or militias in general, state pro-government militias, are so deeply tied to the ruling regime that it will resist formal restructuring and interpret external pressure as a course of threat, then the only thing to do is to demobilize, right? With credible reintegration pathways for rank and file members, gradual contraction of the militia's economic and social functions, and realistic expectations about the gradual pace at which a deeply embedded institution can be transformed. Lastly, thinking about reforming military intelligence, something else that Harold might be talking about, has to do with, this is incredibly problematic because in authoritarian regimes, intelligence and security apparatuses are key elements of control, coercive control, right? In which human rights abuses are often allowed. And so, that's the case with Venezuela. DGCIM agents have perpetrated very serious human rights abuses, right, including torture, arbitrary detention, sexual violence, in a truly systematic plan orchestrated from the highest levels of government. And this is, the UN has documented this. And so, it's necessary to reform and replace the legal instruments under which the organization operates with a clear statutory framework that limits its mandate to external military threat assessment, strips the organization of domestic surveillance and political policing, and transfers legitimate internal security to a separate civilian agency. Okay, so sum up, I think Venezuela's challenge is not simply demilitarization, but institutional reconstruction, and not just in the barracks or in the military or across security, but in a host of other representative and political institutions. Reform has to stabilize the course of apparatus. It It has to remove the military, political, and economic prerogatives, right? And it has to build civilian defense governance capacity. I haven't even spoken about sequencing. Maybe others will do that. If it's too fast, if the sequencing is too fast, there'll be fragmentation and probably violence, right? Because the military is necessary to maintain control over the host of armed groups that other speakers today are going to talk about. And if it's too slow, this might entrench a hybrid regime. And so successful reform requires negotiated depoliticization, economic incentives, and sustained civilian institutional capacity.
Dear John, thanks a lot for walking us through the complexity of the current state apparatus and the necessary steps needed for change. I now want to turn the floor to Harold Trincunas, who is going to also help us wrap up the typical state security apparatus and how it can affect the odds of a transition. The floor is yours, Harold.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you also to Democracy Action Lab and to Hector Fuentes for organizing this. I do have some slides I'd like to share, so let me see if I can get those up and playing. Let's see, are you seeing my slides okay? We're good? Great. So you won't be surprised that, in fact, John and I agree on pretty much 100% of everything. We've known each other for a long time. We've both worked on Venezuela. I'll also say that I'm not going to talk about security sector reform in general, because as you'll see, just the military reform is so complex. So there'll be some echoes of this, of what John just said in these slides. But I hope what I'm going to do is add a level of detail that would help us think about exactly why this is so complicated. I would also point out that if you want to go into policing and police reform, I really recommend the work of Professor Rebecca Hansen, who even just last year published a great new book on policing in Venezuela. So I highly recommend. Hopefully she'll touch on this as well. So just quick outline. I'm gonna make my assumptions explicit about what would have to happen for military reform to be possible. I want to describe sort of what are you trying to fix, what's wrong with the FANBE. Then I'm going to go through sort of what could be done, sort of some of the easy reforms, the mid difficulty reforms, and the most difficult reforms, and then offer a few conclusions. So I think let's be clear. I think this John already said this. Is my screen sharing still working, folks?
Yes, Harold, we can see it. It's not in presentation mode, but
Yes,
we can see
you
your
can
slide.
use the Control L.
Control L. Is
Or
that
view full screen, if that helps.
you mean
And we're still seeing your front.
I think it's frozen because the cursor isn't moving.
Oh,
Right.
let's see? Try again. See, oh, now you're seeing the two slides at once. In the interest of time, should I just keep going?
Yes. No, we can see them. We can see assumptions.
Okay.
And the next one.
Okay. Obviously, there needs to be a transition. You need to have an elected leadership that has sufficient authority to be interested in and capable of executing military reform. And it's not always clear that they'll necessarily be interested in military reform, given all the other competing demands that elected leaders will face in a case like Venezuela, especially given a dire state of the economy, for example, and many other social challenges. You need a National Assembly that's working, where there's a majority that allow you to enact legislation that you need for reform. And you need a judiciary that has been reformed sufficiently to be able to deal appropriately with issues of past impunity. So John touched on this. You need to have the rest of the system functional to a certain extent to address the issue of military reform. So what is wrong with the FANBE? I'm going to talk about it as a bureaucracy. I'm going to talk about it as an armed force, a military qua military, and I'll talk about its relationship to the state. John touched on this, coup proofing. What does this mean? This means that there's no clear lines of authority. There's high levels of surveillance by the security services. There's no esprit de corps. This makes the organization dysfunctional. It is also, at this point, underfunded. This may seem paradoxical in a petro state, but given the parlous state of the Venezuelan economy, being an officer is only a part-time job in Venezuela these days. The military welfare system, which used to be one of the best in Latin America, has completely collapsed. High rates of enlisted desertion. People only stay in long enough to learn how to handle their guns and then desert to join criminal organizations. And it is a tremendously corrupt bureaucracy. And finally, politicize. John mentioned two of the key factors here, a promotion and assignment process that values political loyalty over competence, and one that instills indoctrination via the military education system. So let's talk about what's wrong with the FANBE as a military organization. It is, frankly, too large for the challenges Venezuela faces. And this is one of the reasons it's expensive. Part of this is, of course, the famously large size of the, only John here will know what FOGO means. Flag officer, general officer. It has too many generals and too many admirals. It also lacks a professional NCO corps, which is in any sort of highly competent sort of Western military would be the backbone of the day-to-day operations of the military. It also has inadequate capabilities. I mean, we obviously saw this in relation to the January 3 raid by the United States, but even in some of the confrontations that Maria and Rebecca will talk about with armed non-state actors, it is not really capable of carrying out its own tasks. It is poorly organized and trained, inadequately equipped, terrible maintenance, and this is not new to Chavismo. It's been a historic problem, and it actually still has a deployment of forces that was first put in place over 100 years ago by the dictator Juan Vicente Gomez. So the troops are not near the places they need to operate. And finally, military doctrine, which currently is based on sort of Cuban and Vietnamese conceptions of prolonged popular resistance and civic military fusion, basically, in part, the militia showcases this, integrate civilians into military operations in ways that put them under risk at times of war. And so what's the problem with the Venezuelan military in relation to the state? First of all, it is one of the key political actors. It, along with today, together with the Rodriguez siblings, the president, Delcy Rodriguez, and the head of the National Assembly, Jorge Rodriguez, her brother, Minister of Interior, Diosdado Cabello, and the military are the three local most important actors. Since January 3rd, the United States has joined, the Trump administration has joined that. That's why I tongue-in-cheek say there's not four key players. I think John highlighted some of this. Nominal institutions, civil-military relations are not working. The Minister of Defense is the highest ranking active duty military officer, and it's been the same person for over 10 years. That is a sign that something's wrong. Security and Defense Commission in the National Assembly is not working. And the military justice system, the scope is way too large and is incompatible with democracy. And I can go into that more in the Q&A. And finally, the military is not the only actor which exercises force in the national territory. You can question about whether it's a legitimate actor, but it literally lacks full control over the national territory. So what is to be done? I put these in quotes because I almost think of them as like the kind of talking points politicians might use. These are the easy reforms. These just probably require some resourcing, some pacting, John mentioned. But one is address the economic situation day to day for officers and enlisted personnel. That's an easy way for a new democratic government to breathe some relief into the system, to get some breathing space, to be given a chance by the the meat, the center of the institution. I completely agree that there should be a civilian minister of defense, and the minister should be in the chain of command between the president and the military commanders, as John said. And of course, the legislature needs to get involved and needs to be working. I think that there's an opportunity to win over officers by investing in them. So this is part of education. Professional education abroad can be super useful for instilling democratic values. I think a return to focusing on military training and military exercises, as opposed to all these kind of peripheral economic and political activities, it would be very useful. And in the Q&A, I can talk a little bit more about reorienting military intelligence, but I agree, it needs to be focused on external adversaries of the state, not the internal threat as it is now. And the reason I mentioned this might be an easier one is basically because the rest of the military doesn't like these guys. So, this is not a place where the military will unite in defense of this organization, part of the organization. What are the mid reforms? You could imagine there'd be some opposition, but there'll also be some people who'd be very interested in reforming. So reforming the military justice system might be easier than we think, just because it's been used to repress the officer corps. A large number of political prisoners in Venezuela are former military officers. And so you can make the case very easily, like, let that never happen again. Let's change the military justice system. I think you could probably reduce the size of the field officer and general officer ranks by using some of the incentive system to retire, either payouts, or you can keep what you have now, if you retire within the next year, or any number of different schemes could be used. I agree that the military legislation, even the Constitution probably, needs to be revised, the military status in the Constitution, but also revising defense doctrine. There needs to be fewer roles for the military. They need to be more focused on defense missions, and they need to be compatible with democracy. Some of these functions should be translated over to civilian sides of the government. And I completely agree the militia has to change. And in fact, what I would probably recommend is make it smaller, because there's just a lot of randomness in there in terms of who's enrolled. It probably needs more training and professionalization. And it probably needs to return to what it originally was, which was these were the reserve formations of the regular military. And they probably should go back to doing that. And let me talk about the hard reforms. And Hector, how am I doing on time?
You have 2 more minutes, Harold.
Okay, that should be fine. We talked about promotion and assignments, or John did. I agree. I also agree with reforming the military education system. Corruption is going to be an incredibly difficult problem to address, and there's going to have to be some sort of transitional justice mechanism. And the most important thing that I've learned from other cases is that you have to differentiate corruption from your approach to, participation in drug trafficking or human rights abuses. Because the last thing you want in dealing with criminality in the armed forces for them to develop the mentality that they must all hang together, or assuredly they'll all hang separately. So you want to avoid that institutional defensive reaction, and there probably has to be some mild approach to corruption that doesn't activate the entire institution in sort of self-preservation mode. You're going to have to restructure the military once you've designed a new doctrine for it. It's going to need new capabilities depending on what you come up with. And then obviously they need to invest in sort of recuperating the platforms. I mean, one of the issues they had on the January 3rd raid is that the operational rates in a lot of the air defense systems are like 25% or less, right? So that needs to change. 2 more slides. So obstacles to reform, and then I'm going to talk about things that could support reform. First of all, obstacles. There's no transition to democracy, obviously. Secondly, the new democracy is going to need the military because it faces all these armed groups that we'll hear about shortly from Maria Ignacia and from Rebecca. I think it is going to be very difficult to make the case for reform to the general public, because this is not just time-consuming, it's expensive. It's going to be expensive to do this. And there's going to be lots of other competing demands in a country with such a parlous economy. We should also remember that There is a real center for resistance. Diosdado Cabello, as Minister of Interior, controls the Presidential Honor Guard. He controls the DGCIN. He controls the National Police and the National Intelligence Police, the SEBIN. These are the best trained, best equipped troops in Venezuela. And the rest of the military, I'm not sure how well they do against them. Now, what would favor change? First of all, we have to keep in mind the impact of the January 3rd raids. They have discredited the senior leadership in Venezuela. You're seeing this being reported. El País had a very good article on this last month. Rumblings about how can you have this, like the president is snatched from us and no change in the senior leadership. Nobody takes responsibility. And here I put efecto Malvinas. I mean, if you know the Argentine case after 1983, the defeat in the Malvinas conflict, the junior and mid-ranking officers would simply not obey the generals anymore because they had lost all respect for them. And so I think this is a demoralized institution, and they probably makes them ready for change. They know that they screwed up, and so they know they need to change. And so there's this existential crisis sense due to the loss of capabilities. And finally, I think John touches on this too, if they do democratize and they do try to reform the military, there will be other actors outside very willing to help, which I think would be to the advantage of Venezuela. Let me stop there.
Thanks a lot, Harold. Always a delight to hear your insights. Now I want to turn the floor to Rebecca Hanson, who's going to talk to us about policing and criminal actors that have proliferated in Venezuela in the last few years.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. First, thanks to the Democracy Action Lab for the invitation to participate, and of course to Maria Ignacia and Hector Fuentes for making the event happen. I really appreciate going after two experts on the military because there are very few of them that exist in Venezuela. So it's just really fascinating to hear on that. I'm going to shift quite a bit to first kind of set the landscape, the security landscape, and then think about some challenges. And I'm going to try to talk about state security forces and criminal organizations kind of at the same time. I know that sounds like a lot to do in a few minutes, but I think it's doable thanks to some commonalities that are shared by both state security forces and criminal organizations in Venezuela, as well as a kind of unanticipated outcome that we've seen since January. So the commonalities I want to focus on, first, pluralization, right? So we've seen a really dramatic increase in the number of state security forces in Venezuela over the past 25 plus years. So both John and Harold mentioned the Milicia Bolivariana. The Policía Nacional Bolivariana is a new police force as well that I've worked on for quite a while. There are a ton of new criminal organizations in the country, right? So we just have a lot more armed actors and a lot more armed criminal actors than before. And unsurprisingly, so the other commonality to focus on, right, is that when you have a variety of armed groups with distinct and competing interests, often operating in the same territory, this produces conflict, right? So I think these two things are really important to keep in mind for both state security forces, criminal organizations, and kind of interactions between them as well. The unanticipated outcome that I want to focus on is that as of yet, we haven't seen massive conflict erupt between these groups, right? I mean, this is a really messy security landscape, and it's pretty surprising, I think, to a lot of people that we haven't seen major shifts or changes, I think, in armed conflict yet. And just to kind of jump forward a little bit, I think there's a simple explanation for this, right? And John and Harold have already kind of referenced this a little bit, right? I mean, the regime is still intact. Markets haven't been disrupted. So to a large degree, we're talking about business as usual, right? So just to start, to understand how Chavista governments transform the security landscape, I think we really have to take seriously Venezuela as a case of initially a revolutionary project that catalyzed intense long-term internecine conflict, state fragmentation, and what I refer to in my book that I published last year as a dispersal of coercive power. So rather than consolidating coercive power, the Bolivarian Revolution really produced a very fragmented and dispersed security landscape in which the state increasingly relied on multiple armed groups, some that are inside and some outside of formal institutions, right? So taking state security institutions first, I mean, policing was already a mess when Chavez came into office, right? It was already highly decentralized, pretty politicized, very little to no coordination, right? And then dynamics within Chavismo really just adds to this messiness. So there were already over 140 police forces in the country by the early 2000s. And then Chavez and both Maduro's government end up creating new police forces and state security institutions on top of that with very little effort at coordination, right? So even Chavista officials that I spoke with a few years ago described the security apparatus literally as like a Frankenstein, as an institutional monster that had really outgrown the ability of the state's control, the state's ability to control it, right? There's another factor here in that instead of a unified strategy for a long period of time, there were very competing visions within the state about how to govern violence and insecurity. So under Chavez, at least, we had factions that were pushing for police reform grounded in human rights, as well as civilian policing and institutional professionalization. And then we had other sectors that were really pushing for militarized policing, the arming of loyal sectors like colectivos, which I know Maria Ignacia is going to talk about soon, and then direct coercive control over popular sectors, right? And under Maduro, this vision has become much more coherent, right? So militarized policing and systematic killing in poor and working class sectors has really come to define his government. But still, the way that these policies have been implemented still end up producing more conflict and mistrust between the police. And honestly, I think the best example of this is that there have been a number of very public brawls between two different Venezuelan police forces, the CCPC, which is Venezuela's like investigative and forensic police, and the National Police Force, who are literally like throwing down in broad daylight. And this happened on at least three occasions between 2019 and 2020, right? So it's hard to think of a better example of the conflict and the mistrust that exists between these state security forces. So moving on to criminal organizations, competition and conflict is also a really defining characteristic here. Even though, a defining feature of Maduro's time in office has actually been the consolidation of some criminal groups and their control over territory and populations. So in terms of thinking about armed criminal organizations, just a couple to list are gangs, of course, the mega bandas or like mega gangs, which are these gangs that have consolidated under Maduro. They're larger, they're better organized. We have the colectivos, the sindicatos, and then, of course, the Colombian guerrilla groups that Maria Ignacia is going to talk about as well. So this, I mean, and again, I'm not listing all of the different armed actors here. So, I think kind of boiling this down, what we're talking about is that we have tons of armed actors, both state and non-state, that are often navigating unstable and competitive markets and contested territory. Legitimacy is highly contested where it exists. And collaboration between police forces is minimal due to this mistrust, as well as interest in maintaining control over resources and markets. And this is made worse by some of the issues that Harold talked about before, really this authoritarian protection measures that try to minimize communication within police forces like the SEBIN. So I think acknowledging this diversity is really important because we're not talking about any kind of centralized or cohesive control over any illicit activities at all, right? And drugs aren't even the most important illicit product for most of these groups, right? Really mining, food sales, and extortion end up being more important. So to get back to this question of like why we haven't seen massive conflict erupt yet, as I mentioned, the changes that we have seen are pretty minimal and haven't really done anything to disrupt illicit markets or rents. Again, to a large degree, we're seeing business as usual. There is some documentation by the International Crisis Group. The ELN is taking advantage of the situation to expand their presence and control in the state of Amazonas. There's also seemed to be kind of an uptick in conflict between state security forces and criminal groups, according to data from ACLED, which mostly has to do with attempts to expand control over territory and markets, right? And just to note here, I think other people have already said this, but none of these actors really put up any resistance after January 3rd. Ostensibly, all of these relationships that have been constructed between gangs and the government, between colectivos and the government, between the ELN and the government, has been about coup-proofing, right? And we haven't seen really any kind of resistance put up after January 3rd. I'm sure there are a lot of factors to include here, right? But one big one is that economic interests have just not been disrupted. And we're talking about, a revolution at this point that has no real ideological or political commitments at this point. I think things would have looked pretty different under Chavez, probably. And so I think all of this means that the Trump administration's strategies worked. It was clear from the beginning that the government wasn't really interested primarily in democracy in Venezuela. What they're very interested in is stability. we have the same government in place with a different leader. Thus far, U.S. interests in Venezuela have remained squarely focused on oil. So that's not disrupting illicit markets or the state and non-state armed groups involved in them. And there's been no indication by either government, by the Venezuelan or the US government, that there's really any kind of interest in reforming the state security apparatus, right? So the bottom line is here, despite the, just incredible events that we witnessed on January 3rd, the bottom line is that we're really talking largely about continuity and stability, I think, right? So just to kind of jump to some challenges that are posed by all of this, right? First, of course, as other people have already mentioned, it's very difficult to think about how to reform such fragmented security forces. There are just like so many police forces, military units, hybrid security institutions with overlapping jurisdictions and competing interests. And many of them probably all of them will fiercely defend the survival of their institution or group, right? But even getting rid of these forces and many of their members presents a problem, right? Because mass layoffs of police or military officers often create a pipeline between state security forces and criminal organizations, right? So there's a very pressing question of how do we keep those officers that are let go after a vetting process or after a political transition, and how do we keep them from feeding non-state armed groups? I think another issue is that, as I've mentioned, we've seen a lot of continuity and stability. But unless we see another 20 plus years of Chavismo, then at some point instability and disruption are going to take place. And this is likely going to result in higher rates of armed violence and conflict as markets are disrupted and actors fight over who gets to control those markets, right? So in terms of thinking about the state criminal nexus, if there's a political transition, this disrupts certain agreements in place between gangs and the government. It disrupts state protection rackets for criminal actors. It disrupts state actors' roles in criminal markets. And all of this produces circumstances that really lead to conflict, right? Finally, just in terms of thinking about challenges, as I mentioned, it doesn't seem that there's any real interest in security reform, but that is desperately needed if there is going to be some kind of political transition. But the issue is that police reform, state security reform always creates disruption. This happened in 2008 and 2009 with a police reform that was implemented by the Chavez government. So we'll likely see this again, right? Just a couple more things. I think I maybe have like 1 or 2 more minutes left. I think another big challenge is literally the only policy I think that we're aware of that was popular under Maduro, that was popular across class, right, were these militarized police raids that he implemented, right? Those seemed to be very popular across poor, working class, upper class groups, right? And I don't see any incentives that any incoming government will have to change those militarized police raids, specifically because whether or not we're talking about an opposition-led government, a Chavista government, a mix of the two, any of these governments are going to need legitimacy, support, and consent. And we know from across the region that these like mano dura policies are a very quick way for governments to consolidate legitimacy and support. So unfortunately, there, I think, are structural and institutional factors that suggest that the systematic violence that we've been seeing exercised by police forces might continue. It's hard to see what the incentives are for them to not continue, right? And I think it's also important to note, right, that systematic state violence, of course, against particularly poor and working class sectors, skyrocketed under Maduro, right, but has a very long history in Venezuela that predates Chavismo, right? And this is violence that has long been justified and legitimized through the criminalization of young Black and brown men's bodies. So these are historical, structural, and institutional problems that were exacerbated by Chavismo, but did not arise with them, right? This is not just going to be an issue of like getting Chavismo out of office. These are, decades of militarized policing and impunity have really normalized lethal force as a governance tool. So under these conditions, removing the current government does not automatically dismantle the structures that sustain violence. And as I mentioned before, I think there are actually some incentives for why this systematic violence might continue.
Rebecca, thank you so much. So insightful. And again, it expresses the complexity of the constellation of actors and interests that are involved in the Venezuelan case. Let me turn to Maria Ignacia Curiel, who's going to talk to us about armed actors who are non-state actors, but that are political and not only criminal groups. On the other side, political groups that are also non-state actors. The floor is yours, Mari. We cannot hear you. think you're muted. Yes.
Okay. Thank you all. I'll try to be quick so that we can protect at least 15 minutes for questions from Hector, our moderator, and from the audience. So the groups that I'll be talking about are these non-state armed actors that are political and that I argue sort of are important to think about in this current juncture, but also for a potential future transition to democracy in Venezuela. So these aren't the primary guys with the guns, right? They're not the government's primary security guarantors. They're not also the groups with which like pacting or negotiating would be sufficient to generate a transition to democracy. But they're still critical to think about. And so these are armed actors that have decades-long ties with the regime, with the Chavista regime, and they're part of this broader ecosystem.
Maria, sorry, we can't see your slides. We're just seeing a bar.
Oh, okay.
Maybe try again.
Yes, I will try again. What
Thank
about
you.
now?
Yes, we can see them now.
Okay. Okay. So these are armed actors that have decades-long ties with the regime, and the nature of sort of their relationship and their capacities and their incentives have evolved along with the ways in which the Chavista regime's needs and also sort of circumstances have changed over time. And they are a part of the ecosystem of control, of territorial dominance, of sort of illicit markets and financing, of repression capabilities that the government sort of wants for different kinds of reasons to for these actors to carry out rather than other sort of state security forces, and a part of this broader coup-proofing strategy of sort of dividing armed capacity to exert control of the population without giving any one actor a sufficient control to become a threat to the ruling coalition. Okay, so who are these actors? Primarily, I'm thinking about the Colombian guerrillas that are in Venezuela. This is the ELN and dissidents from the FARC, and colectivos, which are effectively urban paramilitary groups. These are the armed wings of colectivos in Venezuela. So what I want to do is go into a little bit of a deep dive into some of the important characteristics of each of these groups, and then think about what the implications are for transition to democracy. So the rural guerrilla, the ELN and the FARC dissidents, who they are sort of these Marxist-Leninist insurgent groups that originate in the 1960s. The FARC signed a peace agreement in 2016 with the Colombian government, but there was an important faction that never signed or that abandoned the peace agreement. And the ELN, despite sort of numerous attempts at negotiations, sort of has continued to exist within Colombia. And these have transformed effectively, especially from the 90s onwards, really into these hybrid insurgent criminal organizations. A lot of their operations are around protecting, carrying out sort of the distribution, not just of drugs, but as Rebecca and others have mentioned, illegal mining operations and other sort of illicit networks within Venezuelan territory. And there are sort of historical linkages with Chavismo between both of these guerrillas. Chavez had documented linkages with the FARC. A lot of this seems to emerge, especially after the 2002 coup, and sort of in light of that threat to his power. And the strongest linkages with the ELN seem to happen under Maduro in sort of mid-2010s, 2013 onward, as security circumstances for them change within Colombia and they start to be pushed into Venezuelan territory. And really sort of the nature of this relationship between these guerrillas and the Venezuelan regime is sort of a safe haven for them, where they can sort of conduct their operations towards Colombia from the Venezuelan territory in exchange both for protection, rents, and sort of other forms of coup-proofing, as I mentioned earlier on. And this is a map by folks at Insight Crime that's from a while ago, and things have changed. But this is just to give a sense that we're not just talking about sort of a small slice of what is close to the Colombian border in Venezuela. It seems to be the case that the presence of these groups has migrated far into the Venezuelan territory beyond just the border towards Amazonas and Bolivar. And here there's documentation not just of their extensive control of illegal gold mining operations and that of other critical minerals, of involvement in drug trafficking, but broad sort of extortion and contraband involvement. This is of the ELN, but sort of we can think about this being representative of sort of the broader dynamics of these guerrillas. And so the capabilities of these groups, we can think about them as groups that have sort of extensive combat experience and tactical expertise. They have vast local intelligence networks, and sort of it's known that they have installed territorial checkpoints and domestic networks, and they're vastly documented instances of since 2021, especially clashes with the military, clashes with each other, their sort of control of the Arco Minero, and even some instances of electoral repression, of their involvement in operations of electoral repression, which is a relatively newer phenomenon. And so their incentives, of course, are sort of to preserve things as they are for them, right? For them to be able to maintain their territorial control, preserve their economic operations, which are enabled by these agreements that they have, these arrangements that they have with certain elements of the regime, to sort of avoid being targeted by operations that have now ramped up since January 3rd by the Colombian government and the US, and maybe some tenuous ideological objectives that they still hold on to, at least rhetorically, and perhaps some of their rank and file do as well. And they have a lot of uncertainty about what would happen to them under a circumstance of transition. Moving on to the paramilitaries, and I'm mindful of the time, so I'll go through this a bit more quickly. These are effectively organizations that are urban. Again, they didn't just appear recently, but they have been a part of sort of initially sort of local community organizations linked to leftist urban guerrilla movements in the 70s in Venezuela, and what remained of that sort of transformed during Chavismo, at least some parts, into these armed regime auxiliaries, sometimes justified this coordination between them as sort of an important element of popular defense. And there's been both collusion between the state and armed colectivos, and also some competition that I think sort of relates directly to Rebecca's earlier point about there being such like vast heterogeneity and competition in the presence of these actors. But really, they're agents of urban control, like they have control over the distribution of certain goods and services in the places where they're strongest, and they have a vast experience with conducting repression at protests, in elections. We saw them before we saw agents of the state after January 3rd conducting checkpoints in Caracas and other urban centers, for instance. And they're located not just in Caracas, in important barrios, 23 de Enero, Petar de la Vega, but in other cities in Venezuela as well. They have this strong sort of continuous presence in those communities, and then they expand sort of outside of the borders of their localities in times of crisis, whenever they're called upon. And they also have this urban combat experience, both against criminal organizations, at some point against police forces. They're pretty heavily armed, although there has been some effort to contain them by, especially the last 10 years. The ones that remain, that have survived, are still pretty heavily armed entities. They have a level of community embeddedness, although their level of popularity likely has evolved over the last 20 years. And they have similar incentives to that of the guerrilla, right? They want to preserve their current status quo, their control over the territorial and economic networks that they have. And sort of a change towards a democratic transition would introduce a lot of uncertainty about whether they could plausibly retain any arrangement with the state in a way that they have so far. So to quickly wrap up, the big case I want to make is that unlike perhaps state security forces, whose transformation would be critical to enabling a transition to democracy, these agents might not be critical. Like there could be a transition to democracy without their consents. So they might not be sufficient to constrain the transition to democracy, but they won't disappear if there is a transition to democracy, and they could become agents of chaos if that were to be the case. So they have the potential to plague a potential transitional government, whether it's led by the opposition or some mixed coalition. Anyone that threatens sort of the existence of the nature of the agreements that they have the potential to plague that kind of government with violence, to deploy important difficulties in their ability to control vast amounts of territory that aren't densely populated, but that are rich in natural resources, where the state has poor presence. Like if we look to the neighbor Colombia, that's exactly the nature of the problem that they have. Similarly, in Venezuela, there are many places where there's a weak state capacity or state presence, and these groups have the potential to sort of make that an even more difficult problem. And of course, they can create sort of important humanitarian and infrastructure damages that would make sort of the sustainability of governance and of transition all the more difficult. So what to do about this? I mean, agents that are interested in promoting a democratic transition can't do a lot today about weakening these groups, but there are a couple of things they can do. The first is thinking about these as a day one priority, and there can be a lot more that we can do to mitigate information asymmetries about these groups. There are some organizations, local in Venezuela and abroad, that have done a lot of the collection about how these groups evolve, where they're located, what they've done. But it's still there's still more that can be done to mitigate some of the information asymmetries about their capabilities and their incentives. And then there's thinking about sort of drawing on what we know is possible, the repertoire of counterinsurgency and DDR, what works and what doesn't, and different things will be more effective for these two different kinds of groups. It's not just about defeating them militarily, it's about solidifying state presence and territorial control in the places where these groups have operated. It's about addressing the civilian populations that have been victimized by them historically or that could be victimized by them in the future, and then deciding what to do with the former combatants from these groups. Similar to the issue of the militias that have been raised earlier on. Like even if you dismantle these organizations, you're probably going to have to figure out what to do with the people that comprise them and that carried out violence for them. So I will end there.
Great, Maria, thank you so much for your presentation. We have so many interesting questions. I think I'm going to skip mine and just ask the public's question because the audience questions, because I've been not also terribly efficient at timekeeping and reminding everybody. I got very drawn into the presentations and I wasn't looking at the time. We have one first question that is comparing the Venezuelan military to, let's say, the Cuban or the Sandinista army, revolutionary armed forces. And the question comes if there is a difference, between the pragmatism versus the ideological commitment and spirit, the corps in those ranks. I think Rebecca mentioned something about that, about the pseudo-revolutionary origins of Chavismo. John, what do you think of this question? What do you make out of this comparison?
Yeah, I think it's a great point and a great question from Alberto. It's crazy that he's here asking a question. And I think that these things coexist in Venezuela. I think that there is a degree of pragmatism, and I think that actually answers a little bit of Pablo's question as well towards the end, which is that there's a degree of pragmatism within the armed forces of, as crazy as it sounds and as odd as it sounds in this context, of like institutional loyalty and rule following, despite all the rule breaking, and that coexists with the intense level of Chavezification, right, of the institution. And so I see it as a tension. Maybe Harold can disabuse me of this notion, but I see a tension there.
Absolutely. I think that the issue is in the Sandinista and the Cuban militaries, the people who eventually became the civilian leaders and the military leaders fought together. And it creates a set of trust and a
Mm,
set of collaborative relationships and maybe some rivalries, but a history, a shared history of people who know each other well. And the issue in Venezuela was you're trying to transform a traditional, frankly, fairly pro-democratic military by regional standards into a revolutionary military, which is not its natural bent. After all, the Venezuelan military officers who during the first 10 years of the Chavista period, they had been educated on counterinsurgency and how the Venezuelan military defeated the left-wing Marxist-Leninist insurgencies in the 1960s. So I think that led to less of an emphasis on trust and collaboration and shared ideology and more on coup-proofing. And so there's a question that any of the leaders of the Chavista movement would have about their military is, to what extent is their revolutionary discourse authentic? Do they believe this? Or is it performative? Is it self-preservation? To get ahead in the military, you have to mouth these words. And if you don't, you won't have a career. So that, I think, where in the Cuban and Sandinista militaries, I'm sure some people had to do that. I think there was likelihood that that's much greater in the Venezuelan military.
Fantastic. I think I'm gonna connect that point with some other question here, Harold, for you. Placing ourselves in the present moment. Some people have said very successfully that they don't believe we're gonna move to a democratic transition until we don't see some significant reforms of the current security apparatus. So they'll see Rodriguez, the president, she doesn't have the guys with the weapons. We don't know that she has a lot of influence in any of the armed groups, unlike other members of the coalition. Some people have been talking, and this is the question that we have here. Some people have been talking about having a former Chavez era minister back to be the Minister of Defense that can lead a transition from Padrino Lopez, who has been the Minister of Defense for many years. How can Delcy do this? And how can Delcy move about this in the current moment? What do you think are the risks and the pressures?
So I think there's a tension here between the desire from below for change in the leadership, for accountability for the failure during the January 3rd raid, just for the generational turnover. Relevo generacional, Vladimir Padrino Lopez has been there for 10 years. The more junior officers, 12, a long time. Previously, Venezuela normally the Minister of Defense was there for 1 year. And so to be there for 12 years is incredibly unusual. So there's that pressure from below for change. But I think from above, there's this discourse of unity. And so you see the Minister of Interior, Diosdado Cabello, the President, and the head of the National Assembly, and the head of the military all talking about unity. And that is sort of tacitly backed by the U.S. government, which wants stability, not necessarily transition. And so the question is, does maintaining the current leadership guarantee stability, or does it eventually lead to some institutional break? And we don't know yet.
Fascinating.
So, but I could see that bringing in a someone who was seen as trustworthy um, as a bridge could be a way that you could relieve some of the pressure for change, um, uh, show some accountability while still preserving some stability. So I can see the logic of that. That's inherent in the question.
Rebecca, you told us a little bit about illicit rents, right? And how they actually are probably the most important part of the current equilibrium that we see among many actors, even from the state side and also from the criminal and irregular side. Do you think that disrupting those illicit, like thinking strategically, let's say, thinking in terms of sequencing and steps, do you think that disrupting those illicit steps should be part of a second maybe phase for a transition? And I do mention this because when I was looking at Maria Curiel's map, you see that the areas in which they're not operating are the areas in which oil activities are taking place, interestingly. And the places in which mining is happening, that's where you see the regular groups. So, and now we do need oil, right? But we don't have to expel anybody from the oil sectors because they're already out. How do you see this if you think of this disruption in steps?
Yeah, this is a really difficult question. I mean, I think I think in order to try this, I think any of the reforms that we're talking about sound very Pollyannish, right? All right. I mean, we're just in such a different world right now. So what I'm going to say right now is going to sound very Pollyannish. But in terms of thinking about like ideally what might happen, I mean, I think first what you have to do if we want to try to avoid massive conflict and violence from erupting due to disruption, there has to be first effective efforts at demobilization and disarmament of non-state armed groups. Again, whether or not they have the incentives to do this and whether or not that would work, I don't know. But I think that should be the first step before we start talking about kind of anything else, right? I think the same with state security forces. So I think it was John that maybe mentioned this, like the need to differentiate between, what state actors are involved in corruption, human rights abuses, criminal activities. I think that's really important. And for those people who are involved in human rights abuses and these types of crimes, there should be no amnesty put on the table, right? Absolutely. But there is going to have to be some kind of amnesty put on the table for other state security actors to try to demobilize them, to get them out of state security forces. And I think some kind of incentives put into place to keep them again from transitioning into criminal organizations. Because I think that's one of the biggest threats, that if there is successful transition, vetting, removing of officers, we will just see a massive increase in the number of men and maybe some women, but mostly men who are a part of criminal organizations. So I think, a couple other people have mentioned this, there's not really any way forward without thinking about some kind of meaningful political transition, which requires, I think, demobilization, disarmament, amnesty, and incentives to keep people from returning to criminal activities to the degree that we can.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna again. We have so many interesting questions. I don't think we'll get to all of them to finish on time. I want to give Maria Curiel has been the co-organizer of this panel. I want to give you, Mari, a chance to conclude. What were the key takeaways from you for you hearing all of our great panelists on the challenges that we have ahead?
This is tough, but thank you for the challenge. I mean, I think there seems to me like the biggest challenge seems to me to be the tension between what we need in the short term to generate a potential transition and what we need to generate a sustainable democratic governance. And whether that's about reforming the military, whether that's about reforming the police, whether that's about securing territorial control, I think that's the key question. Like we all have a sense of what areas have to change in order for the governance of these groups to be effective. But I think that the question still lies on like, what can we afford? Like what is flexible and what is not? And perhaps part of that has to do with the question of sequencing that John brought up earlier, and also looking towards our neighbors in Latin America that have gone through these processes in Chile, in Argentina, elsewhere, and learn from like the things that they gave up in order to produce a transition, and whether we were willing to sort of take a gamble on the potential mid to long-term consequences of not having sort of the entire reform happen early on, and be willing to deal with some of those challenges later on in exchange for a transition in the shorter term.
Amazing.
I
agree.
That others agree with.
I think that the fragmentation can actually be an advantage in this situation, because you can then align incentives of actors and advance against the others and consolidate something. I think it's way harder to do change like this when you have a very cohesive security apparatus, and I think we've seen that in Venezuela as well historically, how the army coalition. Harold would be more better equipped to respond to this question than I am, but it was very cohesive for the army to move against the leftist guerrillas and side with the democratic government of Betancourt and his successors, because you had that common threat in front of you. So, and that's just to point out one opportunity of having a fragmented apparatus. It creates
the fragmentation is helpful, but I think it creates the possibility of volatility that Rebecca sort of points to. And you don't, and something that I insist a lot in these conversations is you don't need a lot of actors to create a lot of chaos. And I think the Colombians will tell you that, like at the height of the war, the FARC didn't have that many people, and they controlled a lot of territory, and it was very difficult for even a very well-resourced government to sort of contain that violence. And so I think we can't underestimate the threat that even small and seemingly uncoordinated groups can present to governance and stability in the long term.
Thanks a lot, Maria. Well, thank you, everybody. I think we need a second panel to talk about the sequencing and strategic thinking on how to proceed and advance with this. Thank you to our great loyal audience. We're going to be producing a note on this meeting to circulate and get these insights out of this conversation group even. Thank you, everybody. And
thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Seminars. John, Rebecca, Harold, Maria, thank you so much. Great panel. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Ciao.